there, everyone. Here we come. I can see the digital queue and the sort of digital floodgates are opening. So I'll give everyone a few seconds to filter through to the latest installment number 8 of our building an enterprise level system with Xero series. Really excited today to be talking optimizing FX rates and automating reconciliation. It's been a fantastic start to the series so far. Thrilled at the level of insight that we've been able to generate. I've learned so much from the webinars so far, and yeah, really looking forward to the session that we have today. Just a couple of housekeeping points. So you'll see there's the Q&A box in the toolbar. Please do fire through any questions that come through on there, and if our panelists have a chance, they'll respond in writing to some of those questions, and if not, we'll pick them up at the end. So, plan for today, and do brief intros. We then got our discussion of optimizing FX rates and automating reconciliation. I'll then briefly cover what's coming up over the next installments of the series. And that'll take us to the half an hour. And then we'll have, as a bonus, the Q&A off the back of it. So look, very briefly, my name is David Tuck. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Mayday. Our mission is to mend month end, starting with the needs of multi-entity businesses, intercompany recharges, cross-entity bank reconciliation, keeping intercompany loans in balance. I qualified as an accountant at Deloitte to start my career, then been an SME startup finance leader twice, leading finance teams of multi-entity Xero using groups. And with the series, really trying to create the resource I wish I'd had as a finance leader of how best to grow with Xero into our growth phase as a business. I've been an accounting tech entrepreneur for the last decade, previously founded and led Chaser, the accounts receivable automation business, and I've been building Mayday with Griff, my co-founder, and our fantastic team for the last 2 years. And just in terms of this series, so we're for larger Xero users. The majority of our customers at Mayday are in-house finance teams, and we kept coming back to 2 questions that they had. Is Xero still the right system for me? And if the answer to that is yes, how long will that be the case? Is it indefinitely, or at what point will I outgrow it? And the nature of uncertainty is that if we don't know something, it leads us to act earlier. The ERP move is horrible and hectic, as one of our customers described it. It's incredibly expensive, and 58% of ERP implementations fail. We've got this idea of ERP peace of mind, as we've taken to calling it, the peace of mind of knowing whether and how I can scale with Xero as my accounting system. This series is very much about how can we be useful to our target customer. It's not product marketing. It's not about how can we build the best-in-class app stack. There's a reason I'm not wearing a Mayday t-shirt for any of these webinars. It's about writing the misconception that it's not possible to progress with Xero into your growth phase as a business. But it's not about overcorrecting. It's not about replacing one myth with another. That Xero is this all singing, all dancing panacea that any business can scale with for the remainder of time. There will be times where a business needs to move on from Xero, so we also want to bring that out within our content as well. That's quite enough from me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by James, John, and Chris this morning. I'm going to hand over to them for their intros. James, lead us off.
Yeah, morning everyone. As I mentioned, James Scobie from Airwallex. My role day-to-day is in partnerships, so working with accountants across the UK and promoting Airwallex as a payment solution, either for their firms or on behalf of their clients or for their clients directly. And for those that don't know, to briefly introduce Airwallex, we are an end-to-end platform helping clients to collect, manage, and spend across multiple currencies, with a big focus on FX, being able to convert currencies either between a client's wallet or when sending funds internationally. We work with a lot of SMEs across the UK and globally, but also a lot of larger enterprises who are still on Xero, managing multiple entities, multiple currencies on a day-to-day basis.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, James. Brilliant to have you here. John, over to you.
Yeah, morning everyone. John Toon from Beever and Struthers. So we are a mid-sized firm operating out of Manchester, where our head office is, but with a national presence, and we work with all sizes and scales of businesses. So from very early days of startup all the way through to some PLCs that have managed to make their way onto the AIM market. And we also deal with not-for-profits and other types of organizations outside of the main business sphere as well. So a broad range of experience. I now look after a technology team within our business. So we have data analysts, we have developers, we have people that help with automation and operational system, refinement. And my area of expertise is around the technology that helps to do that. So I've grown up, if you like, in the Xero ecosystem, extremely familiar with all of the apps that are out there and what can be done, what the possibilities are with connecting that ecosystem to Xero to help a business to scale, to automate, to operate more effectively, to reach new markets, whatever you want to do. And I also do some work in the ERP space as well if you get desperate and have to move up.
Amazing. Thanks so much, John. Brilliant to have your insights here. And Chris, over to you.
Hi, I'm Chris, co-founder of Eventwise, which is a budgeting platform specifically built for events and festivals. So it does the full cycle, which we've been developing over the last 3 years. But in my other role as well, I'm director of In the Loop Accounts, which is accounting practice specifically for the music industry. So we've been doing FX rates and currency exchanges for all our musicians over the last 12 years. So I'm pretty up to speed with what Xero can do and how it can automate and all the systems that are in place. So I'm looking forward to talking about it a bit later on.
Amazing. Fantastic. Brilliant to have you all here. So let's get straight into it. Well, first up, I just want to frame the discussion. What do we mean by optimize FX rates and automate reconciliation? What are the jobs to be done there? James, I'm going to come to you for this.
Yeah, certainly. So I think from an optimizing FX point of view, it's around finding a cost-effective solution to manage multiple currencies coming in and out of the business. Not only from a price point of view, but one that works for the whole finance team. It can't just be the CFO that has the logins. It needs to work for the whole business. What's important for a team when managing any process, but particularly one around banking and payments, comes down to time, money, and risk. So when finding a solution, one that's going to save the team time, one that is going to be a cost-effective solution, and one that it's not going to be, I suppose from a risk point of view, one that's going to be safe for the business on an ongoing basis. I think from a reconciliation point of view, it's just being able to help record and streamline the process in the finance function. Not having to worry about the bank feeds at the end of the month, being able to have the confidence in a system that it's going to be recorded correctly, not only in GBP in the UK, but also for other currencies that a business may be dealing with.
Love it. That's so clear. Thank you so much. So we've got time, money, and risk, and thinking about that across the whole team.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So look, that takes us to, first off, Xero has its own native functionality. And, before we get into what you can do and how you can grow with Xero plus its ecosystem, I'm really keen that we come first to, that native functionality within Xero when it comes to optimizing FX rates and automating reconciliation. What does Xero itself do well? Chris, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
What does Xero do well? Well, I think it's the speed. We have 70 clients in our accountancy practice, and the speed that you need to reconcile against, but also the way it automates. So you put in an invoice, 6 months ago, and it automates that FX rate from when you actually make the payment. And that's what it does really well. We've actually moved all of our businesses over to Xero from Sage and QuickBooks. I used Sage when it was back on desktop, and you had to manually go in and actually change the FX rates, do a monthly reconciliation, run monthly currency FX changes, and that's just backdated. It's old accounting now, but I think Xero was definitely at the forefront of that change, and that's why I've not really looked back. But I think that's the main thing. The other thing is what it does well is in the tracking reports. It also automates the FX rate against your tracking category as well. So you can see the FX rates if you have a budget for, we do a lot of events. So if I have a budget for artists within a specific event, it tells me the FX rate for within that budget. So it goes down that into that much detail, and that's why I love it, and it's great.
Amazing. Great insights there. Thanks very much. And yeah, you and I share that experience of the manual FX adjustment. So when I was financial controller at Fevertree, which was my first move out of practice, we were buying buying raw materials from overseas suppliers and selling to like international distributors. And yeah, the amount of time that it went to go through and update all the AP and AR for the FX differences, it's easy to forget how that has all now been eviscerated by Xero. Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Chris. That's really, really helpful. John, anything from your side in terms of what Xero does well when it comes to FX rates and automated reconciliation?
I mean, I guess for me, it's just simplicity, right? Is that when they first brought in that exchange rate feed from xe.com, way back when 10 plus years ago, no one else really did that. No one else had a way of automating that, which obviously Chris has alluded to. And that just makes life so much simpler because you remove a massively manual task. I think the other thing that you get in there as well is that Xero is quite clever in terms of the way that it presents the stuff. So you can see as you look at sort of your accounts receivable, your accounts payable, what those invoice values are, both in the foreign currency and in your home currency, so sterling typically if you're in the UK. And so you get a real-time view of what you are owed and what you're potentially exposed to. So that does, to a degree at least, help you to manage a little bit of that risk that James was talking about. I think the other thing is that because it is so simple, it actually encourages you to maybe consider trading overseas as well, because it is inbuilt in there. Yes, it's at the top end of the Xero sort of stack, if you like, in terms of the pricing and the product. But it's well worth it. And of course, within the ecosystem now, you've got connections into products like Airwallex, and there are a plethora of others that help you to access foreign exchange transactions, whether that's through forward contracting, whether that's spot rating, and they were very early adopters of integrating with products both here in the UK and overseas that were trying to change the fintech space and offer easy access to foreign exchange transactions at a lower cost.
Fantastic. And look, that segues brilliantly into we've covered the huge benefits, particularly looking back over the sort of the 10-year and the evolution of cloud accounting period that Xero has delivered when it comes to FX. What then are the growing pains when it comes to FX and automating reconciliation? Chris, I'll come back to you first here.
The growing pains, well, in terms of FX with Xero?
Absolutely.
With it, the problem is the more FX rates or more FX exchanges that you do, it means the more your team are going to be involved in it. So too many cooks spoil the broth is always a big thing for me. So I think when you're scaling up and you're matching them against budgets, when you have too many people involved in it, your budget's not going to be as accurate. And the main reason is because of that is because someone goes on, does an FX rate or does an exchange, and then the budget, the actual P&L budget for that code will be slightly different because the FX rate is on the operational costs. So the person in charge of, say, on my side, artist fees will see a P&L, and they won't see the foreign exchange loss or gain, which is in the operation costs. So that I'd say the growing pains is the more people that work on it, the more inaccurate you could become in terms of putting it against your budgets. And I mean that's the whole reason why I'm kind of for pushing it ahead and focusing on events, because they need as much help as possible. And accuracy is everyone needs it, but you have a lot of people working in events, and so that's I would say that's a growing pain on my side.
Fascinating. John, anything to add from your side in terms of those growing pains?
I think there's probably two. One is again goes back to the cost thing, and again James kind of mentioned this, is that people are wanting to kind of manage their transaction costs and their FX costs as much as possible, and I think one of the challenges sometimes can be to get some real visibility around what your FX costs are. It's well known that if you transact through a high street bank, that it's going to cost you more than maybe with what some of the fintechs out there. But actually, getting some real visibility of what that's costing you is quite challenging within Xero, because it doesn't necessarily present it in a way that's easily sort of consumable and manageable. I think the other side of it, as you do scale up as well, is that you tend to want to take a little bit more control of your FX in terms of considering things like forward contracting, managing that risk a little bit more so that you've got some more certainty. So again, kind of goes back to Chris's ideas about budgeting as well, is that if you move from a relatively small startup where you're quite comfortable to maybe buy something from China or from America and import it at a spot rate, as you scale up, the spot rate management becomes a bit more complex, and actually getting into managing those rates through forward contracts or something similar becomes a bit more important. And that is clearly challenging within the Xero product itself, because that's not easily done. So you do have to go outside of that space to get into forward contracting. And the reality is that there's not that many apps that do it. And so if you kind of revert back into the standard banking system, the standard banking system doesn't really sort of interact particularly well with Xero to make that work. So that is a challenge. And that is ironically one of the areas where an ERP, such as one of the big ones, in particular like SAP or NetSuite or something, does have that functionality, but clearly that comes at a considerable cost.
Right. And look, this is a good juncture to touch on the ERP move point. Anything we've covered so far in terms of those pain points that should be red flags for people that they have outgrown Xero and should be at this point moving to an ERP?
I mean, I think for me, the really simple pain point or the really simple red flag for realizing that you've completely bust the seams with Xero is when you can't run the reports. That's kind of like the immediate red flag. So if you come to try and do your VAT return at the end of the quarter and you run the report and it kind of says, computer says no, you've got an issue there. It's well known that Xero and a lot of other cloud products have soft limits in terms of transaction volume, and actually that's the reality of a business that scales and grows with using Xero, is that you've got to understand what the impact of those soft limits is on your business, and the immediate impact that you see is actually around reporting and being able to generate reports. And you'll see that reports fail in organizations that are really pushing those limits in Xero. Now, there are lots of ways of managing that, and I'm sure we'll probably get onto that. But that for me is the immediate red flag. That everything else is kind of manageable within the ecosystem, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. I think that's such a great heuristic, right? Of if everything's working for you, then that's a pretty good indicator that Xero can still kind of scale for you. One thing that's come through really clearly in this series is it's not about size of business or number of team members. It's about complexity of processes. And if and when a particular process falls down and that can't be addressed, plus Xero and its ecosystem, and that may manifest when it comes to the transaction limits. Brilliant. I'll go from there into, would love to talk about how Xero plus its ecosystem can help. And Chris, I'd love to come to you first in terms of when it comes to optimizing FX rates and automating reconciliation, what you've been able to do.
I mean, I've gone through so many FX companies. I've actually just landed and finished on Airwallex for the last couple of years, thanks to James. But I think that the main thing within the ecosystem is the automation that you get, and the speed that it's sort of, I don't know, it's hard to explain when you're going from one to the other, but the support within the add-ons so that you use them correctly within Xero is the most important thing. Like, there's so many add-ons to Xero within the ecosystem, but it's how best to use it. You can sign up to anything, but you need that support to guide you in the best way possible, I'd say. And within Xero, I would say that's the most important thing in terms of the ecosystem, is how best to use the add-ons.
And John, over to you in terms of your clients and what you've seen them be able to do when it comes to sort of FX with Xero plus the ecosystem. Would love any stories you're able to share of the impressive feats
Impressive feat. I mean, I guess you know, I think the first thing is that, you know, when we first started using Xero, you know, 10 years ago, and the reality was back then the only product that was kind of doing FX that was particularly well integrated with Xero was what was TransferWise, has now become Wise. And ironically, Xero and Wise's relationship has kind of fallen apart fairly recently. So you know, they're not as closely integrated as they once were. Was that all of a sudden what you could say to a client was like, look, try this product out, see what it does in comparison to, say, NatWest or whoever it is that you bank with, and suddenly look at the vast difference in cost that you can you know, you can see in terms of transacting on there. And that was like, you know, pretty mind-blowing for some of our clients in terms of what you could do. You know, some of the stuff that we're starting to see, you know, more recently, you know, is that you can now do, you know, things like forward contracting within the ecosystem. You can start to book, you know, US dollars, euros, etc., at particular rates, which, you know, really you could only do within the normal banking system and you couldn't do within the ecosystem. And again, like I say, that lends itself to being able to manage and sort of understand your exposure to risk, and certainly for scaling businesses, that's of real interest to them. But I think like I said earlier, really what it does is it just allows you to open doors, you know, in terms of, you know, I think lots of organizations, you know, if I go back when I was, you know, a trainee almost like 20 years ago, you know, lots of organizations, you kind of fell into trading in Europe or with China or with the US or wherever it was, didn't really know what they were doing. And then everything was very cumbersome. It was very manual, you know, whether it was the accounting, whether it was dealing with, you know, VAT or cross-border taxes or whatever. And just being able to take away one little pain point, which is like having to not enter FX rates every single day to manage your exposure and manage the accounting is absolutely amazing. And you know, I think that just helps. You know, it just makes everything a little bit more smooth, really.
Amazing. James, were you keen to come in on anything here?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things to highlight, especially with the Xero ecosystem, is it's constantly changing and evolving. Airwallex came in 4 years ago, Mayday in the last 1 or 2 years, and certainly our integrations have gone, you know, lots of different updates, lots of different iterations. I think we first started from an integration point of view, more from the reconciliation point of view, helping to streamline bank feeds and currencies coming in and out. Whereas a lot of the integrations that we're doing now is to help larger businesses stay on Xero, rather than having to move to something bigger. So an example of that, we've got payment links on the Xero invoices. Being able to attach payment links helps a business get paid faster, but also it keeps Xero at the heart of the finance function. They're not having to go onto another system or another platform to do that task, which then you may need to, you know, reconcile later on. So I think, yeah, from us, it's around making Xero at the center of the day-to-day, rather than having lots of different apps. And I think to John's point earlier as well, it's a lot around awareness as well. So some of these apps there's lots of different things that they can do. You know, we have the UK bank feeds, but then there's also other currencies. So rather than having a high street bank and then other apps that may not sync with Xero, it's really kind of delving into the products that are available on the ecosystem and making them, I suppose, fit for purpose.
Amazing. And I think it's been so clear to me listening to this. There's stages of it, right? There's the optimization, if you will, of, well, previously I went and booked FX transfers with my bank, and I now get to do this in a way that enables me to access a better rate and saves me a bunch of time in doing that. James, to your point, keeping Xero at the center of the finance function. And then, you know, John, as you were talking, I sort of saying, well, then there's the next concentric circle of maximize. It enables me to do more, to be proactive about FX, rather than just, okay, I need to book a transfer today. What's the spot rate? And then that third point that comes through from both, you know, Chris and John, your points of how it just enables a business to think internationally earlier. It's not something that sort of happens by accident. It's okay, we can be deliberate, we can entertain this from day one because we've got this in our wherewithal now. Fascinating insights, everyone. So I mean, off the back of that, I'd really love to get, when it comes to scaling with Xero, what are your top tips for doing so in pursuit of I guess the spirit of the series, building an enterprise level system with Xero. So Chris, if I could come to you first, and then I'll go to John and then James. Chris, what would be your top tip for scaling with Xero?
I would say that the main Xero does everything it's built for, every company out there, but it's not specific enough for each industry. So my top tip would be definitely look at the add-ons, because they do add so much value to your accounting process and systems, and do a huge amount of research into it. Pick the right one and then fully adopt it into your process. Don't go half-heartedly into it. So do as much research as possible to find add-ons specific to your industry. Still use Xero as your core accounting system, and then just fully adopt it and across your whole team.
Nice. That's really interesting. So see Xero as great, but in a industry agnostic sense. So look at it as your core, and then the local, the kind of specification of that to your pain points is where the ecosystem comes in.
Yeah, I mean, I've got one specific pain point that I should have raised earlier, actually, but it happens a lot in my industry in events where you've got a lot of freelancers working within the event, and they're creating purchase orders or sales invoices. Within Xero, if you give them a purchase order user, they can actually see every single purchase order for that whole event, whereas they shouldn't be allowed to do that. And Xero doesn't quite explain that to you or to the users out there. So you don't actually know until someone goes, excuse me, why is this person being paid so much more than me? It's because they can see one's purchase orders. And Xero doesn't have the permission where that person can't see anyone else's. So it's sort of that there are pain points within Xero, and that's why you have add-ons to kind of help you with your accounting process.
Fascinating. Thanks so much, Chris. John, over to you. What would be your top tip?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably very similar to Chris's, really, which is to maximize the ecosystem. I talk about, when it comes to the ability to connect apps into Xero, I talk about this kind of concept of apathy in terms of, people just look at the Xero store and go, oh God, there's 1,200, 1,300 apps that I could possibly plug in. And as James says, it's ever expanding and ever more complex. And then that immediately puts them off. And that then exposes them to that risk that Chris was just talking about in terms of, there are limitations with the core Xero product. It is really fundamentally designed for a relatively basic business to start up on. And then, as he said, as you grow and expand, you start to use the connected apps. So in Chris's example, the next logical step for him who wants to, for him or a business that wants to manage purchase orders in a much more complex way is to go to Approval Max and to use that and connect that into an OCR product to do the invoice scanning and things, and to automate more of that. It's got much more granular controls. It's got much better user access controls. It's got much more complexity built into the product, and you can do so much more with it. And that is just the next step. The challenge is whether you do that research yourself or whether you come to someone who knows that ecosystem inside and out. And the reality is that there are very few advisors that do know the ecosystem really, really well and can advise businesses. The other thing that I would say is that, as your business expands, really, really understand what your business processes look like, what your operational processes look like. We talk about Xero as the hub of the wheel, and off that, every other operational process within the business is a spoke that should connect back into finance. But those operational systems are going to fundamentally change and adapt as you grow, as you add people to the organization, as you expand into maybe other territories. And more often than not, what we see, and this goes back to your point, David, at the beginning about why ERP systems fail, and we're seeing this in Birmingham City Council at the moment, is that they do not adapt and change their processes for the new technologies they're bringing in. They try to run their old processes around the technology that they brought in. Whereas actually what you've got to do is you've got to look at that and say, well, this new system that I bring in is taking away a process, or it's automating a process, or it's fundamentally shifting a process in a slightly different way. And you've then got to adapt around that to make sure that you maximize the benefit. We very often see that organizations that bring in ecosystem apps into Xero do not necessarily make the best of those because they're not adapting the processes. They're trying to make those fit around the pre-existing processes. And you wouldn't, if you moved from a tablet of stone and chipping away with a hammer and chisel, and then start to use a pen and paper, you don't start trying to hammer that pen into your piece of paper when you're writing. So why, when you move from, say, a manual process like that to something much more digital and automated, you don't need that hammer, you don't need that chisel, you don't need that pen. So just have a think about what you're going to do with that and optimize what you do.
Fascinating. Yeah, I love that. That's such a great insight around, adapting your process, not just bringing in the tech to shoehorn in your existing process. James, you're just finally coming to you. What's your top tip?
Yeah, I think speaking from an app partner point of view, it's finding solutions that cover a lot of bases. I think John just mentioned there's 13,000 apps out there or something, and so there's no point using hundreds of them if you're not going to be able to use them to their full ability. Take the time to really delve into the product, what it can do. I think all our partners would appreciate me saying, listen to the updates, the constant products that are evolving, because it may be that you've already got something that you're looking for. And also, to Chris's point, take the time to fully take the team through the product as well, understand the functionality, understand what it can do. Because there's a lot of great apps out there that can make the Xero ecosystem or the Xero experience far better.
Fantastic. So let me briefly preview what's coming up over the next few days in the series, and then we'll get into the kind of the Q&A as a bonus to today's session. So tomorrow we've got Automate Enhance Your Accounts Receivable Processes with David Rowland from Energize, Vicky Ellis from Not Just Numbers, Joe Wood, Virtual FD, and Chrissy Chapleo from Chaser. And then on Monday, we've got Plan Effectively for Every Scenario with Sophie Conahan from Rora, John Gaunt from FD Works, and Timur Abdal from Causal. And then on Tuesday, we have Speed Up Bill Processing and Make Bulk Payments with Josh Elster from Yardlink, Emily Deacon from More Growth Accountants, and Joe Lines from Nook. Details on the screen there, enterprise.getmodo.com to register for any and all of those. And so that just brings me to the Q&A. So I've had a couple of questions come through. So first off, what's the best way to educate the team about FX considerations? Chris, I'll come to you first on this, but then John and James would love your thoughts as well.
I would say pay for it, pay for training, like to be able to FX rates and software around that automate reconciliation. Again, there's 1,300 apps or whatever out there. Pay for some help to get the training who can advise your team on how best to use that software. And if you pay for it, you're more likely to really fully adopt the process. So I would say, to get your team into it, I would get into a full training session with someone else to come on board and help you make use of the add-on or the process in the best way. Personally.
Fantastic.
I think to jump in there from an app point of view, we're more than happy to talk teams through the functionality, industry specific things as well. Not just around Airwallex and what we do, but taking the time, I think is pretty important. Whether it's a monthly update, coming in, Airwallex is happy to come into the office and talk through who we are, what we do. But I think just taking the time to delve into it and really commit to it.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, in terms of specifically around FX, I think one of the challenges, particularly for accountants when we're dealing with businesses, is that if we're presenting things like management accounts or even year-end accounts to clients, number one, obviously that's retrospective generally, but also the way that we tend to account for FX is it's just, as Chris was saying earlier, it's like an operational cost. It's in their overheads. And quite often, if a business owner or an FD or whoever it is not sort of overseeing that on a regular basis, that number is just appears, and it could be a positive or a negative without too much understanding of what that is. And I think as accountants, sometimes we're a little, we kind of forget that that's a number that should be discussed and should be explained. Because and I think because it doesn't always end up in gross profit or in direct cost or something, that it sort of gets forgotten about. It's a bit of an afterthought, even though it is a cost of doing business, particularly if you've got a lot of international trade. And one of the things that we've done in the past when we have been a bit more proactive with clients is that, for example, I had a business that traded predominantly in the US, so most of their FX exposure was in dollars. They pretty much processed all of their transactions via Stripe, and Stripe's FX rates, when you convert that back into sterling, are pretty terrible. So we just did something really simple, which was we brought in a product like Airwallex to settle that US dollars into their account and then use their exchange rates to bring it back into sterling. And it saved them, I don't know, 10-15% in terms of what their exposure was. And this was a business that turned over a few 100,000, was scaling quite rapidly, and you can imagine that the big impact of that was quite significant. The other thing that we talked about as well was about, you don't necessarily have to always convert that money back to your home currency. If you're trading in the US, both buying and selling, for example, then you don't need to move all of that money back into sterling, then to sort of convert back to make purchases, for example. And it's just being a little bit more clever around that. And I know those things kind of sound simple, and maybe as accountants we just kind of assume that everyone knows them, but I think sometimes people don't always understand that that's one of those things that can be done. And having apps like Airwallex just means that you can run multi-currency accounts within your business much more easily, rather than in the past, where maybe, again, if you're in the traditional banking space, you just have a sterling account and then just suffer the costs of having the balances settled in and out of that.
And that links to the final question I had actually around the sort of the rise of natural hedging with global accounts and kind of virtual accounts. James, John, have you seen a real rise in that?
Yeah, I think from an Airwallex product point of view, like when you think about FX, I suppose the traditional way is sending money overseas for supplier payments or maybe wages. But actually it's almost more valuable doing the inverse, being able to set up bank accounts in the US, as John mentioned, keeping those funds for as long as they need them. If they have payments going out in USD, you're essentially eliminating that FX cost. But then when you do need to convert funds back, you've got the ability to do that when you need. So I think the FX is constantly changing. The traditional broker model is something that Airwallex has looked to develop and put the power more on the user being able to manage time when they wanted to convert funds, but also setting up the right infrastructure from day one to prevent costs, but also just to make their lives easier.
Yeah, and I think I think sometimes it's just about being clever, and I know that sounds incredibly condescending sometimes, but people that go into business that decide to then trade overseas, that doesn't make you an FX broker. That doesn't make you someone who's going to be tracking interest rates and exchange rates all over the world. And fundamentally, who wants to do that unless that's your business? But it is about trying to minimize cost, minimize risk, and make sure that we're accounting for these things properly. And as I said before, and as James just said, if it's around sort of just that kind of almost like natural hedging of your risk, that's a great thing to do. Because again, the reality is, if you're a relatively new business and as you scale up, until you get to a certain scale, from a traditional banking point of view, you're not going to have exposure to anyone who's going to provide you advice on hedging, forward contracting, any of those kind of things that really are the preserve of a 20-25 million pound plus business that's in the sort of commercial corporate banking sector. And so that's where using the technology that you've got at your fingertips helps. And again, like I say, there are apps that are helping to do that. Airwallex are bringing that kind of that concept into space. There's a few other apps as well trying to do that and trying to create more visibility around FX exposure and risk management. And that's the great thing about having connected technology. You'd never have that on a desktop product. The reality is as well, you probably won't have that in a lot of ERP products as well, in terms of being able to scale up, because again, you're shifting to a slightly different type of technology that's maybe not as well connected.
Amazing. What a great note to end on. So look, thanks so much to Chris, John and James for joining us today. Incredibly rich insights that you've shared. And thanks to everyone who's joined us. Look forward to seeing you over the course of the rest of the series. Have a great rest of the day.